Hello, good afternoon and welcome to this book reading of Vreemde eenden by Martine Beijerman, who is sitting next to me. I just wanted to introduce the session today by remarking that this is an important opportunity to hear from an author who has spent over 3 years discussing this topic of inclusion and diversity in today's fraught world. And when Martine provides her presentation, I would like to encourage the audience who can view us online to ask us any relevant questions, because we're all in fluid discussion here on this topic. So what do we concern ourselves with when we think about diversity and inclusion? Lots of very sensitive ideas come to mind when discussing this topic, especially in today's world where there is such polarization, such inequality, such hate, and such discord. And so we have to understand the manifestations of this in various contexts, but also the reasons they go on, and what we can do as humankind to better ourselves in terms of how we relate to each other and how we think about inclusion and exclusion. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Martine, who's going to provide us some deeper insight into this topic. Thank you, Martine.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me all. This Saturday morning, I was reading the NRC, and in at least 7 instances, I saw illustrations of human behavior to exclude. I read about Joyce Sylvester being the first black mayor in the Netherlands. Her story reminded me of the lonely battle for inclusion by many activists. I read the column of Rosanne Hertzberger, and she discussed the fact that if you go on television or radio, there's a lot of makeup involved, especially for female guests. And it reminded me of our tendency to always follow the social dominant norms. I read about the negligence of the parliament to address sexual transgressive behavior by parliamentarians. I read about the Danish migrant ghettos. And it reminded me of the conversation I had with psychology professor Mina Sikara at Harvard about the political rhetoric to make the other invisible in order to make us less engaged and less empathetic towards their well-being. The past couple of years, I tried to look beyond the headlines, and I learned more about the profound reasons why we exclude the others. I spoke with scientists, I read books and research articles, and I looked at documentaries and I listened to podcasts. But I also had conversations with friends and family and relatives. I was looking for answers to my primary question: why do we exclude others? Exclusion is a very complex and multi-layered phenomenon. Exclusion is about homophobia, it's about anti-Semitism, and it's about everything in between. It's about us. It touches upon concepts such as status, hierarchy, prejudice, social norms, power, fear, and control. It's about myth, hidden histories, sensational media, online hate, clashing moral belief systems, and identity. Speaking of identity, who am I? I have a PhD in law, and since the summer of 2016, I live with my family in the States, in Connecticut. There, in the States, I'm an immigrant. Here, I'm Dutch. I'm white, I'm female, I'm mother of 2 children, I'm cisgender, abled, and heterosexual. As you can tell, I'm part of many dominant groups here in the Dutch society and in the American society. As a writer with an activist ambition, I focus on the behavior of the often silent majority. This book is not meant to protect marginalized people. It is meant to address our own flaws existing in a dominant majority that impact the chances for an equal, fair society in which all people can live in freedom, peace, and security. Exclusion is everywhere, activism too. If you want to start understanding exclusion, strangely enough, the journey starts with love, and it preferably ends with love. It starts with the first barrier to inclusion, a selective type of love. The love we feel for our own group, in-group love, as the psychologists tend to call it. In order to fight exclusion, you need the opposite. You need an all-encompassing critical love, as philosopher Sullivan argued. Let us start with in-group love. Since forever, we form groups. Groups function as protections against outside threats, as a way to take care of each other, to share stories, to share traditions, to share rituals. From childhood onwards, we rely on a tribal unity that nourishes us, that educates us, and protects us. We emphasize our group relationships with symbols, traditions, ceremonies, stories, rituals, and body declarations, such as, for example, tattoos. The groups we feel connected to, they act as a mirror. We feel proud when another group member gives us a positive judgment. Coinciding with our own environment and our own community gives us a sense of self-worth and belonging. We are also constantly striving to distinguish ourselves from the group. After all, we are all unique. We would like to express ourselves that way, what we believe, who we love, where we come from. All of these aspects are important to our need to determine who we are. Our identity must on the one hand be recognized and appreciated by others around us. I learned from political scientist Fukuyama. Psychologists explain the urge to differentiate between groups through the human dislike of a vacuum. We humans need order and clarity. To think in us and them ensures that a line is drawn on the basis of which you can judge the world around you. We see this everywhere. We see it at the playground. We see it at work. We see it at the universities. And we also see it in a military struggle for the rightful claim of territory. I spoke with the biologist-anthropologist Richard Wrangham, and he told me that already 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, humans that were part of a tribe didn't use the word human to describe other people falling outside of that tribe. The importance of being part of a tribe in order to survive has affected our brain. Fear is one of the most primitive alarm functions to keep us safe. When we experience an imminent danger, the amygdala in our brain gets activated. We make a quick decision to fight or to flight. There's, however, something a bit troubling with our amygdala. It's not a very nuanced alarm system. The amygdala in our head, it doesn't distinguish between a real fear or a real danger or a feared or suspected danger. So whether there's a threat of a bear in the wild or a possibility of losing your job because there are more immigrants in your country, the same amygdala and the same primitive responses are triggered. This is not without consequences. With fear comes uncertainty. Uncertainty about what to expect reinforces our feelings of stress. Stress or anxiety becomes more manageable when you know or you think you understand why you are afraid, according to philosopher Nussbaum. She refers to Aristotle, who already figured out that we do not experience fear as much when we think we can control everything and we are untouchable. In that reading, fear for the other is really little more than a perceived lack of control. To regain control, we've found a way out, and that is relevant to my research. We like to blame others for our suffering. Whatever reason the suffering might be it a lack of jobs, unstable political situations, a lack of health care, rising crime numbers, you name it. The distinctions we make between groups of people is far from neutral. Distinctions are often based on stereotypical thoughts, of which some already roam around for centuries. We tell each other stories in which we attribute images and character traits to a specific group. And there is something telling in the way we do this. The ones that describe the other are hardly ever positive. We feel the urge to come up with narratives and we hardly question them. In group love, the love we feel for our own people does not immediately mean that the one group hates the other group. Professor of social psychology Mina Sikara explained that to me. It's more about a feeling of indifference for everything that happens outside of our own group. Yet there's a real risk involved. Political leaders who benefit from divisions between citizens can use our loving, inward-looking gaze to increase their own position of power. If a distinction between groups is made often enough, the individual aspects of the other becomes gradually less visible. The other becomes this homogeneous, characterized by generalized and stereotypical characteristics, instead of a collection of people with individual desires, individual ambitions, individual belief systems. When looking for a justification of oppression, it is extremely effective to characterize the other as like inherently different from ourselves, as a threat to our existence. The other can be presented in many different ways. It can be wild, less civilized, less human even. Certain groups with deviating belief systems or nationality or skin color are supposed to be less worthy, and this binary rhetoric builds on the human tendency to create social hierarchies. And it might lead to aggression and organized violence, but it can also lead to everyday examples of exclusion and structural racism. Exclusion is everywhere, activism too. In order to protect society against the human tendency to self-preservation, aggression, the need for status, and the lust for power, many governments have opted for a democratic system of government. We would rather divide the power than let one person lead the country. Activists, citizens, and governments are fighting day in, day out to live up to the democratic promise of freedom and equality for all. Inclusion happens when there is a change in thinking. And the change in thinking is set in motion by a long journey of visible and invisible activists. They are setting the tone for a more inclusive standard. Thanks to the work of activists, women can now open bank accounts. We can vote. Minorities can vote. Homosexuals can get married. We are starting to think very differently about gender fluidity than a couple of decades ago. Small wins are made. I remember that my husband's employer made a video and he sent it out to all his employees, over 4,000. And in that video, he expressly stated his preferred pronouns. A clear sign of a new, more inclusive social norm in which gender is seen as a spectrum rather than a binary distinction. Everywhere, racism seems to be rejected as immoral, at least on paper. Despite the progress made and the formal equality enshrined in law, international treaties, and constitutions, some citizens live in more freedom than others. There is a contradiction between what we lay down in law and everyday reality. This contrast is expressed in, for example, the disproportionate police violence, but also in structurally less opportunities for certain groups of people to jobs, good education, safe neighborhoods, mortgage, and appropriate health care. This is all because we tend to exclude the other, more often than we are aware of. So we have in-group love. There's the aspect of fear and threat. There's the urge to control our fears by pointing towards a scapegoat. And there's the roles of leaders who talk us into believing that another group is a threat to our existence. At the same time, discrimination, xenophobia, validism, homophobia, and racism are openly rejected in the United States and in Europe, in legal texts, at school, and in the media. This is an improvement objectively. But the downside is that the different forms of exclusion that affect our social interactions are sometimes more difficult to name, to identify, and extra difficult to accept. Easily enough, we distance ourselves from these primitive responses I just described. We believe we are more inclusive than the behavior of those groups. And this certainly applies to those people who try to live up with full conviction to the Enlightenment ideals of freedom and equality for all. And this is this kind of cognitive dissonance, as they call it. It happens because our brain is unreliable to a certain extent. We all have automatic processes in our brain that we are unaware of half of the time, but that are largely determining how we see someone else. There are two psychologists, Mahzarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald, and they wrote a book about this. And they suspect that the unconscious prejudices of all Americans together have a greater effect on discrimination against certain groups than the conscious prejudices of those groups who openly express their racial or ethnic dislike. Two types of biases may have to do with this. You have racial prejudices that can be consciously suppressed in a desire to appear politically correct. But most of the prejudices are based on the simple fact that the owners are unaware of their own exclusive beliefs. Our brain works in wonderful ways. We tend and we see the need to categorize everything we come into contact with. And during this categorization, processes take place that automatically draw conclusions that are not reliable. There are many automatic reflexes of these kinds that makes it difficult for us to look at the world with an open, unbiased view. And this is partly because most people tend to overestimate danger and negative situations. Psychologists call this the negativity bias, which means that we can remember negative information better than positive information. There's another mind bug, and that forms the basis of those stereotypical myths about the other, and that is the outgroup homogeneity effect. Our brain is socially equipped to live in groups. Within our own group, we have a keen eye for difference, while the people who fall outside of our groups are very similar in our eyes. And this has real consequences. We are, for example, very easily empathetic towards a group member when they make a mistake. We can provide it with context. This happens to a much lesser extent with the other and when they make mistakes. Another mind bug is that we tend to immediately give new information a place in our head. This is called anchoring. What we observe while walking down the streets or scrolling through our media feed or watching a movie, it does not end up in a vacuum. Our brain does its best to connect it with what we see, with previous memories, observations, or thoughts. And an automatic trick in our brain that makes this anchoring problematic is what the psychologists call the availability heuristic. With some observations, you manage to link the memories more quickly. They are more available to you. You've heard about the subject and you stored the information before, so it takes no effort to make a connection in your own brain between that event and the memory. Again, this is not a flawless system. When you think about something quickly, the brain concludes that such an event is therefore more important and it occurs more often. Because otherwise, we would not be able to remember it so well and quickly. And we again suffer from that built-in negativity bias, and the combination of those psychological reflexes can lead to strange conclusions in our minds. The more negative the information is, the easier it's available to our brain. The more available the information is, the more credible. There's a risk involved given the role of the media that constantly seem to draw attention to sensational stories that only give more food to our tendency to draw a very unsophisticated image of the other. The media have become more and more commercial, and we, the viewers, are sensation hungry. And in order to continue to seduce the viewer, there's an excessive focus on incidents, on crime, on violence. Suffering sells. As a result, the broader context is often missing, and this is partly due to the speed with which the news has to be delivered. The rapid flow of negative coverage makes it practically impossible to understand the larger story or context that might explain certain behavior, instead of giving room for essentialist ideas that slowly but surely can dehumanize the other. During my studies, I started to realize that one of the main barriers for inclusion is that the public debate on exclusion, there's a strong focus on perpetrators, on the victims, and not so much on our collective responsibility as bystanders. One of the current media trends where you can see this happening is the cancel culture. Because of internet and social media, canceling has proven to be a very effective method of exclusion. Books are cancelled. Speakers are cancelled. TV programs are cancelled. This is an interesting method because it aims to address social injustice. But it's also specifically aimed at individuals or individual institutions. Cancellation is often seen as a necessary first step to enforce accountability for exclusion and to initiate a change in thinking in our own societies. In this struggle, the end justifies the means. In a period in which unjust social systems are being dismantled, individual victims might be made. The cancel culture raises many difficult ethical questions. Besides the room for accusation, is there also sufficient room for defense? For mutual respect, for dissenting opinions, for context? In other words, for due process? How does a person get rid of this punishment? And at the same time, you can wonder about the necessity of cancelling. Are official bodies, such as judges and prosecutors, doing enough to fight exclusion? In that respect, isn't the cancel culture a much needed tool in the fight against sexism, racism, and other forms of exclusion? The expression of dissatisfaction and anger that underlies canceling could be seen as an act of emancipation. The person who is cancelled almost always has a dominant position in society. Cancellation shows that marginalized groups that have long been or still are in an oppressed opinion can make its position can make itself heard and can take and receive the space to address social injustices. It's a signal to society that exclusion is no longer accepted. Like all the issues affecting exclusion, cancel culture is again a multifaceted phenomenon in which it's difficult to say anything meaningful about cancelling in a general sense, because the reasons for cancelling and the consequences of cancelling differ so much in individual cases. Sometimes it's about exposing criminal behavior. Sometimes it's about violations of a social norm. Sometimes it's based on a misstep that someone did maybe 3 decades ago. Sometimes you are confronted straight away with your misbehavior. Sometimes cancel culture is very cleverly framed by politicians as a weapon in an attempt to dodge criticism and accountability. Sometimes cancel culture hits a celebrity. Sometimes an individual without a public profile is suddenly cancelled. One of the reasons why cancelling of someone gets such an excessive support is our human tendency to follow the dominant opinion. Being part of a social group has its downside. Because we love to be united, we love to follow dominant social norms. And because of the fact that we as humans are relying so deeply on being included ourselves, you cannot assume that the majority will base its opinion on an independent assessment of sufficient information and knowledge. Our opinion may just as well be prompted by our desire to conform. According to constitutional lawyer Cass Sunstein, the development of norms is therefore an often self-isolating and reinforcing system in which our own ability to make decisions based on our own authentic moral considerations can quickly lose strength. Notwithstanding the fact that cancelling might be initiated for the good reasons, namely because someone violated the law or an important social rule, we need to be constantly aware that there's also space for people that have dissenting opinions. What I find interesting in the dynamic of cancel culture is that there is this moral superiority lurking beneath the surface. On the one hand, there's a moral superiority of those who cancel violators of social norms. The attitude can easily go from addressing a social problem to ruthless punishment of other people's behavior. The accusations aimed at an individual norm violator can take up a lot of space in our social media landscape. It's easy for bystanders to label the behavior of the cancelled one as so serious that they quickly morally dissociate from the behavior. But when they do that, they also distance themselves from the whole problem of oppression, including the call for change and reflections on their own part. On the other hand, the same moral superiority lurks in those who oppose the act of cancellation on principle. Do they not hide behind the rejection of this instrument precisely because they want to block the call for change and because they don't want to give up any power position, consciously or unconsciously? One of my main takeaways of researching exclusion is that we humans are not very self-reflective and critical towards our own biases and judgments, towards the lack of context we provide for the news we read and listen to, and towards our own desire to be and to stay part of the group. What primarily stands in our way is a crazy twist of thought, which apparently affects all of us, all people. We ourselves are convinced that we are morally right. In my view, this phenomenon plays an important role in the human tendency to blame others for things that go wrong, and thus to ignore our own responsibility. Apparently, people have an ingrained sense of moral superiority, and we all think at the core that we ourselves are right, that we have the monopoly on truth, and that we are able to distinguish fair from unfair and wrong from right. Our self-image, in terms of moral qualities, is exceptionally positive. We systematically overestimate it, all of us, as the study of Ben Tapin and Ryan McKay proves. This tendency to overestimate our own moral superiority may also support the idea that we have earned ourselves the position we occupy in society, which is characterized by, for example, money, power, opportunities, or prestige. A vicious circle can happen, in which people not only accept the place on a hierarchical ladder, but also appropriate it and attribute it to themselves, in the belief that they make better use of the opportunities given to all. They are just smarter, or they put more effort into their own work. This overestimation can also lead us to judge other people with a lower social status for not making the best use of the opportunities they are given in life. A conversation on exclusion is often difficult and sensitive. The significance of exclusion as a social phenomenon is often downplayed. The majority of society seems to rely blindly on existing frameworks of non-discrimination laws and policies, and others doubt the truthfulness of the call for change. Discussion on exclusion often focuses on the perpetrators or the victims, and not so much on us, the silent majority, and the very powerful role we can play in supporting an unequal society. A conversation on exclusion is often further complicated by feelings of guilt, apathy, and shame. There's another ethical dilemma that also has to do with the excessive focus on the individual in our current media landscape. When individual perpetrators are publicly accused of transgressive behavior, news consumers are also massively drawn to the personal information of the victims, out of the sensational urge to find out everything, whatever the form of oppression is central in the specific case. On the one hand, attention to this social problem is very important, and it shows empathy to reflect on the consequences of exclusion. In this way, we prevent the damage of exclusion being misunderstood or being swept under the carpet. On the other hand, it also seems that without that emphasis on the individual emotion, on one person's guilt or another person's pain, we don't quite know how to have a conversation. At the same time, structural forms of exclusion remain out of sight, as does the broader context that structurally supports, reinforces, or creates it. And then we sit down and we discuss exclusion. But once the discussion on exclusion starts, we encounter different problems. Often there are many sensitivities. There might be tears. There are people that feel offended. And most of the time, there seems to be a huge communication issue. There seems to be a big difference between what one person says and the other person hears. There's this issue of information imbalance. Marginalized groups within societies, they know everything about exclusion because they experience it every day, while the majority is often unaware of any harm done. The whole question of discussing exclusion and the factor of exclusion in a democracy is about the big question. Who do we want to be as citizens, as people? We humans have many confusing combinations of moral contradictory tendencies. We're very flexible in making new groups and drawing new dividing lines. This makes us, on the one hand, vulnerable to populist rhetorics, but also open to new inclusive stories. An inclusive society starts with collective self-reflection and critical love for the other, but also for ourselves. With critical love, we prevent ourselves from falling into the trap of focusing on differences, on a misstep of another, on the creation of a fictional enemy, and on excluding someone who deviates from our morals or normal. Collective self-reflection makes us aware of possible well-intended but inefficient pitfalls in the struggle for more equality, such as the presumption that we ourselves are free from stereotypes and judgments, the assumption that it's mainly other people who exclude. We are all normal, we are unique, we are aggressors, and we are peacemakers. The advantage of this day and age is that just as leaders can influence their audiences like never before by fueling fear for the other, activists, journalists, and artists can build great muscle strength to inspire and connect people. As long as we recognize exclusion, examine our own role in exclusion, and take concrete actions to combat oppression, we can move forward on the path that lies ahead. A society in which we do not waste our energy on hate and polarization, but in which we shape our shared future and indivisible freedom with critical love.
Thank you so much indeed for that fine talk that provided so much content and stimulation. Let me take this moment to reflect on some of those remarks. And also just to introduce myself, my name is Tahir Abbas. I'm an associate professor here at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs. And some of my work concentrates on exclusion and inclusion. And I think that's where we begin when we think about inclusion and exclusion. We are putting people in categories. These don't exist in vacuums. For me, a lot of these issues are because they're conditioned because of historical, political, sociological, structural dynamics that are resistant to change. Also, this idea of how we view the other. Imagine a situation of 8 newly born babies in a hospital. They don't see color, they don't see gender. Everything we have by way of racism, exclusion, gendered norms that we perceive in relation to them are socially learned concepts. We learn all of these things through our interactions with our institutions, with our family members, the books we read in school, and so on. So with all of these many different forces operating at any one time, when we think about who's in or outside our group, lots of pressures come to that point. So we know there are historical issues, we know that there are ongoing issues, but at the same time we know that, for example, in the UK we have some of the strongest anti-racist legislation possibly on the planet. Yet we have some of the most deepest structural inequalities in potentially the world. England being one of the most class societies in the world. So we have a problem that's historically embedded and unresistant to change. 80% of American wealth is inherited. So the opportunities for social mobility are really very limited. So the status quo is reproduced, and people who have faced difficulties continue to do so. So what do we do then when we are quite well aware of all of these problems? You focused a lot on the psychological, so how we think, how the mind works. But a lot of these are much more about material, lived, everyday realities. So how can the psychological work with the existential realities that we face on a day-to-day basis?
Well, it's interesting. I think to start with the fact that if you look at the role the majority plays, of course, it's very powerful in pushing for change, and not only change into laws, but also change into policies. And I feel like it all starts with the individual self. And I know that our power seems to be limited, but in every single role we play, as a citizen, as a parent, as maybe an employer or an employee, we have power. And we have power once we are aware of these problems, and once we are aware of our own thinking, I think we can, instead of only relying on those automatic processes in our head, we can reflect on those. And that's kind of the interesting part I constantly encountered while researching this topic is there's always both. So the paradox of having a democracy, of being proud of a democracy, and on the same time not going to the voting ballot or having asking for more requirements for people before they can vote. These are all dynamics that are partially based on historical context, sociological and political context, but it's also happening everywhere, in every single level. So I feel by keeping it small, we kind of start to feel responsible for it. And if we all do that, we can together maybe strive towards a more inclusive society. But that it's hard and that it will take time, that's 100% sure. But you can also be quite positive towards the progress made last 100 years. Absolutely,
quite true. While we think about some of the bad news, there's always a lot of good news going on. But just to perhaps go back to some of the perhaps more challenging dynamics, the people who are able to make decisions that have bearing are the powerful. The people who are affected by exclusion tend to be the powerless, marked by color, by gender, by differential sexuality, etc. So those kinds of conditions are also, I've got my sociological hat on, so I tend to go back to some of those founding principles. We do have the opportunity for people to ask questions online. We have our very expert audience sitting with us, among us. So I'd like to open the floor up to the rest of us here for any comments, thoughts, reflections on this talk or anything else that's come about since.
I would love to quickly respond to your final point, because I think that's one of the, for me, the most challenging point of view, because Indeed, but what I like about I'm a democracy theorist by background. So what I like about democracy is, at least on paper, you all have an opportunity to go and vote. So obviously I have this kind of naive trust in the fact that as long as you go and vote, you at least have a voice. And it depends really on the matter of exclusion. Some minority groups are very hard to change in terms of it's very hard for the minority to become the majority, even when you all go and vote and be politically active. But democracy is so much more. It's also about social power and gathering together and doing demonstrations. And we've seen like a huge increase in political power if you look at the last couple of years as a response to Trump. But of course also because of the murder on George Floyd. Yeah. So I still have this belief in democracy that at least if we gather and if we demonstrate and protest, we can make our voices heard and build up a stronger majority.
I think change is inevitable, but we also have some problems. Every 40 hours, a black man is killed by a white cop in America. Okay, 221 cases before the George Floyd case in Minnesota were in play, where we have cases. So we have all these, and 20 million Americans came onto the streets of America last year to protest, and obviously in America, but in the rest of the world too, and here across the Netherlands as well. We saw lots of reactions. But we could talk extensively. Let's try and open up to our panel here. If there is anybody who would like to raise a question or a query.
Do you want to start or? Okay, well,
Suzanne.
Thank you, first of all. I'll introduce myself shortly. I'm Suzanne. I'm coordinator diversity and inclusion for 2 faculties within the university, faculty FGGA and faculty of law. And I wrote some things down because first of all, I would love to make the connection from all your research maybe to the environment we're in here, the environment of the university would be great. Because I wrote down that exclusion and maybe exclusion is really in habits and in how we're used to behave among others, and it's really connected to fear, as you told us. And I was wondering, do you maybe have tips or something, or how we can avoid the fear or how we can fight it? Because I can imagine it feels really safe to be within a group and to feel connected to others that maybe have the same thoughts as you or the same perspectives. But how can we think about ourselves in a more strong way and to minimize exclusion by that?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's always, I love the questions that force me to think beyond theory and put it into more practical context. If you talk about the environment we're at right now, I feel like universities, as every other institution, they just have to take care of a safe space for everybody. So on the one hand, you can, of course, on an individual level, try to become more trustful instead of distrustful to anyone else. But it really depends on the context you're put in. And I think if you want to create a safe environment here at universities, it's very important that all questions are heard, that all voices are heard, and that if there's something going wrong, which happens all the time, as you just summed up very briefly, that at least there's a way to address that problem and they take it seriously. And then we're back at the kind of silent majority. Universities being most of the time in a very dominant position in societies, they have to kind of reflect on the own choices they make. Also on practically every level. So what type of lecturers do they, are employed? How diverse are the professors themselves in terms of gender, whatever you can name it. Look at the curriculum. What are we teaching our students? To what extent are our potential future lawyers aware of those biases? For example, when they go to court and they have to maybe ask questions, or they are hoping for someone to testify. And I think we're just at the beginning of being more aware of what we ourselves as universities can do to increase our awareness not only at the student level, also at our own level as being teachers. You know, and that's the kind of, it's funny because I spoke with Alison Blakely. He's a historian, a black historian, and I'm telling that because he studied specifically the role of Dutch white people towards black people, and he also studied that towards the Russian people towards black people, and he compared it with American attitudes towards black people. And he is, as you, I sense, quite, you know, realistic about what democracy can change. And for me, it was a very interesting conversation. Also because those power structures are so hard to beat because they're ingrained for over 400 years. And sometimes it's also about making the invisible visible. So that's why I talked about invisible and visible activists. Even if in our histories, when we talk about emancipation, strangely enough, even with the abolitionists in America, we focus on the white activists, whereas there's so many stories, there's so many backgrounds on black activists. And nowadays I see the like wonderful initiatives here in Amsterdam with the Black Archives, for example, but now suddenly those stories finally come to surface, and we have to kind of embrace those and celebrate those and share them, those with whatever audience you can find.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, all right. So, further reflections. Nadine, did you? No. Oh, please, Emre, please.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on Suzanne's question. My name is Emre Seener. I'm the ICT and Education Coordinator of the faculty, and I'm also a member of the Faculty Council, and in that role also of the Task Force Diversity and Inclusion. My question was a follow-up on Suzanne's question, because as an organization, not particularly this organization, but in general, what can we do to maybe reduce or to improve the burden of evidence that exclusion is occurring right now? Because what we're talking about now, and you mentioned it as well, inclusive curriculum, etc., those things couldn't be discussed 2 years ago because it wasn't an issue. It wasn't on the map. So, and unfortunately, we have to wait for these kinds of horrible incidents to happen in order for people to realize that something is going badly wrong or we need to change something. So, not to let be those incidents in vain. How can we improve our own burden of evidence, or what can we do about the burden of evidence to prove that things are going wrong? Because just to make people more aware of those things.
What I love to do is always look at the people in power. So for me, that's kind of the most straightforward argument I can use in whatever conversation I'm having. Because I know that 25% of the Dutch inhabitants have a migration background. I don't see 25% of the CEOs or whatever boards or professors or politicians, or I don't see the people in power representing those groups. So I don't even want to try to explain the suffering of excluded people, especially because I'm in most of my identities, I'm part of a majority, but I'm a woman, so I have some experience on that respect. But the thing is, why do we need to expose the suffering, expose the pain, whereas we can also, we still need to do it because it's so convincing. On the other hand, you can see it in a structural way. There is a huge imbalance in who is in power and who is not. And it's the white male primarily that is in power. So for me, that always works really well.
But white male, pale and stale has been in power for a very long time.
Very long time, yeah. It's funny because I spoke with a sociologist here in the Netherlands, and his name is Maurice Krul. He's working for the Vrije Universiteit. And he is doing research into super diverse cities. Yeah. And that is very interesting because there you can see the changes in power, not yet in power maybe, but at least in terms of the population and the dynamics that occur. And it reminded me of an essay I read of a historian who is Latinx American by background, and he wrote about this little town close to LA where first the white people were in power, then it was taken over by the black community. Finally, they fought extremely hard for this, so I don't want to, you know, rush through this story, but then you see that now in the same town, I think it's Compton, there's a huge increase in Latinx Americans, and they are not in power. So I think it's interesting to kind of take that dynamic and look from a very abstract way and then put it back into the context to see what's happening here. People love power and they tend to hold on to it very firmly. But obviously it's true that if you look all around the world, whites are in power.
Yeah. On this concept of superdiversity, I remember the scholar, Professor Steve Erteweg, who's at one of the Max Planck Institutes, invented it on the back of some envelope about 15 years ago, and it became very, very popular. But it's getting quite a bit of a backlash at the moment, because what is superdiverse? Is it just lazy shorthand for not being able to explain the complexity of different ethnic, racial, historical issues in any one particular locality? Question mark.
Yeah.
So we go on with this because it's never ending. Historically, it's embedded. Structurally, it's everyday. Culturally, it's the norm. We're making dramatic shifts in the last 1 or 2 years in the response to something quite tragic. But should we be then expecting some kind of white majority backlash? Because these things do go round. Trump was a response to Obama. Trump version 2 is potentially in the making. All of these things do tend to go in cycles. We do have these times when we talk about the multicultural high water, but it's a good time to be diverse, and that's probably where we are now. But then there could be a situation where we reverse back to type, because, as we say earlier, white, male, pale and stale is still in charge.
Yeah, and I think what you already mentioned is that it's so hard to keep our attention span there when there's no incidents happening. Yeah. That's kind of, I have no answer to this because I find it so, I think that's one of the core problems of democracy at large, is that we have our private interests, but democracy and taking care of our people is a public concern. So how do you move from a private interest into a public collective concern? And I didn't find any answers yet to that question, but I think it relates to your concerns.
Please, yes.
Thank you, Martine, for your very interesting and engaging presentation. I have a two-sided question. From one side, you were talking about that actually making this transition to more, to less exclusion, let's say, is being more reflective and being more, practicing reflection much more. And I'm wondering, how can you train that particular, let's say, very challenging skill on a daily basis? Because, and that comes, let's say, the second side of my question, because when you mention examples of, okay, what do we teach students? How does our colloquium look like? These are huge labor-intensive concepts, which I'm sure you're aware of. How do we hire people? That's, that's massive. So if you talk about, okay, start small, but at the same time be reflective. How do you actually transition to that, and how do you make it your daily job, let's say?
Yeah,
that's a
very good question. Yeah, and the thing is, what is hopeful is that indeed you can train your kind of empathy muscle. Yeah. So that's the hopeful part I ran into while researching this. There's also something about when do you start this type of education, and apparently kids in between 6 and 8 years old are very open-minded and open towards these concepts of training with different, working together with different groups. And the downside is that after 8 or 9 years old, it kind of sinks. Like there's not much to change at that moment. So actually, you should start at a very early age with kids, and you can try to train kids to be active bystanders, for example. And then there are some, there is one psychologist, and his name is Staub, and he's very, I'm generalizing now. Never mind. He has done this research in 1993, so quite a while ago. And he researched that indeed to be an active bystander and to be aware of all those processes and want to be reflective on your own choices you make, these are always the strong people, strangely enough. So when you talk about the people in, for example, war times are the ones that are helping other one out, these are very composed, strong persons. So that is why I mentioned in the very final slide, I said you have to love others, but you also have to love yourself. So you have to kind of, make boundaries, take care of yourself. And The problem is with our psychological mindset, indeed, we can train ourselves for a while, but it's very hard to keep those inclusive thoughts for longer than 24 hours. So it's a very hard process. The only thing you can do, I think, and that's why I say you have to reflect on yourself, also be very critical and open towards your own mistakes. So if you see you have this big pile of people that are trying to get a job, and you put your diversity or your inclusion mindset and you switch it on, try to, it's very easy to, after that task, to walk away from your job and move into your other identity as being, for example, a soccer mom, or you have to do groceries for your children, or you go home and you take care of whatever, your pets, and then it's very hard to keep the same mindset still working well. So that, I think it's a matter of training and the willingness to train. But before you're willing to train it, you have to be aware of, I think, these dynamics. So it starts with knowledge and education.
Would you then argue that institutionalizing this training, so for example, when you hire someone, that there is always someone with diversity and inclusion agenda on the committee, is that the way forward, to sort of have an institutional reminder to keep track of that?
I think I feel, but maybe I'm generalizing, that I've been living in the States for 5 years. And although we in the Netherlands tend to say that everything is worse in the States, I feel like in terms of inclusion and the discussions on how to hire other people, they are way beyond the discussions we have here in the Netherlands. So I'm not an HR expert, so I find it very hard to answer your questions. But I do see that the practice there is so much advanced in terms of being super aware of who you're hiring for what job, and not only hiring, but also what are the opportunities for that person to grow into the actual power positions. Yeah. So obviously there's tons of research done, I guess.
But I mean, there are a lot of different processes at university as well, right? So it's not only hiring, so it's also educational committees who sort of review the courses. We're teachers, we're researchers, so it's much more than just hiring, and this is just a very small fraction actually. And then, still, we do have the position where the majority, those in powers, in university-wide, it's still male and stale, right? So how do you then engage? How do you try to change it? Let's say with the soft hand, because you want to you don't want to cancel anyone out, right? So then, how do you? Is this? What I'm trying to ask is does it help to institutionalize it?
Yeah. It's interesting because I've never, I didn't take a stance personally, but intuitively I would say change is not happening. Why not have a quotum, for example, and why not just state, I need 20% for now that at least have an ethnic another ethnic background than the 100% it is now, for example? Or why not at least have a plan and a strategy to work towards having 50% female professors? I mean, I don't see harm in being in institutionalizing those ambitions, because I also fear that it otherwise just takes too long. But that's a political decision to make for universities. Yeah.
I mean, the university discussion, given that this is where we are, it's very, very substantive, because it's not just about what students learn and the content of what they learned and how they think and their knowledge systems. It's about how systems around the students work, from the point at which the students enter the door to the point at which they leave and enter the labour market. And there are obviously lots of things that haven't been open to change. In 445 years, we've just appointed the first female head rector. So it's taken some time to bring about some kind of gender equality. I think what my colleague's alluding to is that while we can have localized individual examples of change and active change, the structural systems around us all are still very resistant to that, and sometimes we get pushback. So this idea of quotas in relation to employment targets, it's deeply resisted in many ways, although it's become necessary in order to bring about those changes. So we do have a greater proportion of women professors than we've ever had, largely because the pressures have been applied. But we're trying to think about widening the curriculum here at our faculty. And that's creating all sorts of questions. Well, don't tell us what to think. This is the bastion of freedom, literally. And so we teach what we think is appropriate. But at the same time, some of our content is exclusive, not inclusive. And we're speaking to an exclusive audience, and we don't necessarily want to do that. So we have many challenges, and I know I sit around my colleagues around the table talking about these regularly.
Yeah, and I think for me, and that's actually part 3 of this book, is about democracy and the resistance. So I find it extremely interesting to just investigate and talk through with anyone at the table. It's like, why are you resisting this so much? Like, what is at stake? Yeah. And the moment you start to address the resistance in itself, I feel like you open up the discussion on a very honest and painful point that indeed it is about holding on to your power positions most of the time. It's funny because I was at the University of Amsterdam, and while being a PhD student, I also saw, of course, the role gender played. And we gathered with all kinds of female young scientists, and we discussed the fact that, you know, when you have to give a presentation in our boardroom, so to say, faculty room, you're surrounded by those paintings of white male deans, right? Yeah. and it's maybe one would say it doesn't impress me at all. I personally didn't think too much of it, but the moment I saw it and I realized it, it affected me in a way. So after a couple of years, a couple of my colleagues, they initiated offering a new painting of the first female professor of our faculty. And strangely enough, those little steps really did help, because now she stands out as the only one there. So you're starting to realize, oh, why, this is a strange image, you know. And we didn't even get started about the fact that they're all white, right? So, yeah.
Martine, we have a question from an audience here. And what is the motivation to write this book? And I think you sort of started talking about this because you moved to America and suddenly things became very different. So tell us.
Yeah, I moved right after defending my PhD thesis. And the PhD was about democratic legitimacy. So when I arrived in the States, a couple of months later, Trump was elected. And I saw also the resistance of society, in the sense that the day he was elected, the next day there was the huge women march, right? You remember that everybody went out. And for a couple of years, I was just kind of observing what happened. And after a while, I thought, I've been thinking so much about democracy, but I only thought about it in a very institutionalized, theoretical way. And I just wanted to understand, wait a second, if we as citizens, as people, do not trust each other, what are we going to do with all those beautiful democratic ideals? So for me, the motivation was to understand, what does democracy require of citizens instead of the system? So I understood, you know, all the rule of law principles and institutional preconditions, but I wanted to look at, if nobody feels the urge to go to the ballot box, if nobody dares to speak out, what, you know, how happy are we with our freedoms of expression or freedom of press if it's just in practice not working out? So that was the main motivation. I mean,
in America, we've seen practices actively put into place to stop people from registering, to stop people from voting. So even the democratic system prevents democracy from operating.
For sure.
And that's disproportionate against people of color and poorer, disadvantaged.
There's always the same people that are victim of these processes. And the sad part is that indeed, after Obama was elected, most Republican states started to put restrictions in place for people to go and vote. And these were all very neutral restrictions. And that is why I find this discussion about democracy so interesting, because on the one hand, it could be that those restrictions were actually made because they wanted the fairer elections, because they wanted to prevent voting fraud. That's the argument. But the effect of it is that people that don't have an identity card had to buy one, which is quite an amount of money. DMVs, the bureaus you go to get your identity card, because they all had to acquire a photo ID, they were closed. So suddenly you only had a couple of ways to get your identity card. If you work full time, because you have to take care of your children, it's very hard to just take a day off to go to the DMV a couple of counties away and to get your identity card. And this sounds all neutral, but the effects are not neutral at all.
Significant enough to such an extent that because of the efforts made in Atlanta and Georgia, we finally got the result that most of America wanted. So So a lot of intervention had to be put into place, but yeah, it's in the hands of individuals to do so, but it's very difficult with all these historical issues. I wonder how much time do we have left to continue? 5 minutes. So in the last 5 minutes or so, I just whip around the audience here to, yes, Nadine, please do.
Thank you, Martine, also for your presentation. It was very interesting to hear. I myself am still young, I'm a student, and I'm educating myself on the topic also about how to speak up, how to voice my opinion. But sometimes I still feel that there's something that's holding me back to say my opinion, and I'm not sure what it is, and I'm not sure why it's holding me back. So I was wondering if you have any advice for young adults like me, how to speak up, how to voice your opinion without feeling like you're doing something wrong, maybe offending people with other opinions, because I still think that that's very difficult and uncomfortable at times.
Yeah, I really relate to your question. I think it's a personal struggle on the one hand. On the other hand, what I found very interesting of being a young scholar back in the days is that one of my male colleagues, and I studied in Sydney for a while, and he gave me the advice to every single time there is a talk, just raise your hand. Just at least pose one question. And for me, that was already a barrier. So I felt like, yeah, but is my question relevant enough? And, you know, what do I know? And if you're long enough in academics, and I stepped out because I wanted to do it in my own way, but you see a tendency of people to pose a question just to show their knowledge in terms of like power structures, like on an individual level, which is interesting. It says something about, you know, what do you want to learn something, or do you want to give something? And these dynamics, you see it everywhere in every conversation. And I think that is again the personal level, but how to train it, it's just to force yourself. But for me, writing this book, I mean, I had sleepless nights because I also know that every single topic I touched upon is extremely sensitive. And who am I? I'm a lawyer. Why do I write about exclusion? I don't have a sociology background, or, you know, and I just relied on science and on the stories and the interviews I had with other scientists, but it's still a dangerous topic. So I really relate, and the only thing I could say, you still have to have them because it's the only way forward. So it will be awkward. There's no way out. I mean, if your uncle makes a racist remark, just addressing this will be awkward. It will not be, you know, hyper-friendly. The only thing is that once you did it and you get a conversation going on, at least it's out there and you can, you know, give at least your perspective and share it in a respectful way. And more from a philosophical background, I learned that once you get into conversations together, every participant has to agree on the rules of the conversations. And that is actually to have an equal position before you even start talking. And I think that is a really important one.
Thank you.
Valuable advice indeed. I think a lot of us could benefit from that. So, well, I think we should try to draw this to a close. I just wanted to say how wonderful it was to hear this insight, because it brought into play ideas of law, of the psychology, of the human mind, of social relations, of the complexity of modern life, with the framing around the arrival of Trump and all that came with it. So I think there's lots there. I personally hope for an English translation of this book very, very soon to benefit myself.
I hope so too.
Because it's a weak in my Dutch awareness. And I think from all of us here, it just leaves us to say a very big thank you to you for the presentation and for answering these questions in such a detailed way. And good luck with the rest of the book. Thank you very much indeed.
For having me. Thank you for all the questions.
Thank you. That's it?
Thank you.
It's a wrap.
It's a wrap.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was really good.